Welcome to the Executive Hustle podcast, where I am your host, Kirsten Urich, speaker, author, retired CEO, mother of four, and recovering workaholic. Explore with Central Pennsylvania local executives what it takes to lead well, live well, and learn well. Understanding that leaders cannot survive, let alone thrive, without a spirit of curiosity, a discipline of accountability, and a disposition for vulnerability. Let's dive in. Welcome to the 1 year anniversary episode of the Executive Hustle. It is my pleasure, and I'm so excited to just have this opportunity to reflect and celebrate on 1 year of the Executive Hustle, the lessons that we have learned in leading well, living well, and learning well. You know, when I started this podcast journey, I had three simple values in mind. I share them with all of my guests, and they really embed and focus my questions with my guests. And they are curiosity, vulnerability, and ownership. I believe that these are three essential leadership values, but I also had no idea how profoundly that they would come out in the stories and the experiences that our guests would share. And so as I look back on the conversations that I've had over the past year, I'm really just struck by how each guest has embodied one or more of these values in a really unique way, teaching us that leadership is not a destination. It is a daily practice of getting better. One of my favorite ways that curiosity showed up was when Kurt Stoner, you can find him on episode 12. He said, you know, his whole journey, his whole career journey, and as an entrepreneur, started with looking at somebody else doing something and saying, I'll bet I could do that. I mean, how brave, how curious to have something so simple be the driving force behind his entire career. You know, and then we had Jesse, and you can catch him in episode 6. And, you know, he looked at how private equity was working for the wealthy and said, you know, can I make it work for the middle class, for people who can't access that? You know, and he turned the whole model on his head by being curious about that. And so many other curiosity stories were just weaved in. Nick Aday from Central Penn Youth Ballet, catch him in episode 2. You know, he really talked about how curiosity comes out for him when he's teaching his students, right? It's a ballet school. And they produce so much more than just ballet there. And he said, you know, the more I taught, the more I became a better dancer, the more I became curious about, you know, who I was and why I was there. And just such a great example about how curiosity really brings out our own human performance as a leader and what it can do for the people that are around us when we lead with curiosity instead of, and I think I talk about this in one of our bonus episodes, but instead of leading from expertise, right? That's not the higher you go as a leader, we have to lead from curiosity because the right answer is in the room. And if as the leader, you're always the one giving the answer, there's really no reason for anyone else to be in the room. So we had so many stories that really highlighted that and validated that as one of the values of good leadership. The next one that really came out in so many stories was vulnerability. Our guests did not just share their successes, but they opened up about their struggles, their failures, their moments of doubt. And if you listen to some of these episodes, there were also some tears, mostly from me. But vulnerability isn't about weakness, right? It's about having authentic leadership and creating real connection, knowing that, you know, your real self is what people want to connect with. Justin, our very first episode, Justin Leader, episode 1, He shared childhood stories that were probably perhaps the most vulnerable examples we had in the entire year. Um, he heard it said about himself, he'll be lucky to graduate high school if he doesn't end up in jail. Imagine hearing that as a teenager and then going on to beat all expectations. It was the fuel that drove his mission and it helped him become resilient. It's an amazing story. Go back and listen to it. Episode 1. It was also reissued just a couple weeks ago, early in June, this June 25th. Drew also, episode 8, talked about, the vulnerability. It comes from working on something that's hard, and how we do those things, not because we want to, but because they serve greater purpose, right? That was in a physical capacity. Allison's story, episode 5, she talks about being an advocate for marginalized populations, even when it costs you in your business. This is an opportunity for us to learn about what vulnerability looks like in these leaders. Her willingness to stand up for her values despite the consequences, so powerful. Another personal story comes back around from Jesse in episode 6, one that really touched me personally. When you're growing your business or you're growing your career, you can become really disconnected from your family if you're not careful. And that happened for him. It happened for me. And there are some real hidden costs and some real truths to pursuing ambition if we're not careful about keeping what's most important right in front of us. So some really great lessons in Jesse's episode there. Matt Zahn, great episode, great podcaster himself. Check out his podcast, Stories of Attraction. But episode 11, Matt really talked about, was very vulnerable and opened up about, a pretty pivotal time for him when something didn't go right? A presentation, a big moment for him in his career. And it was like this catalyst is that's never going to happen to me again. And it really showed how one of our lowest moments can become transformation for us. And he's vulnerable about that, right? Talking openly about how that was transformational for him. And sometimes our biggest failures can become our biggest success stories. The last and third value that really intertwines this podcast is ownership. And it's not just mere accountability, but it's that full all in taking responsibility for yourself, the systems, the relationships, and the environments that you are creating as the leader that sustain success around you. And we had some awesome examples about all in accountability and ownership from some of our guests. Folly in episode 14, so not too long ago, really talked about some great ownership around relationships, right? So his phrase was results through relationships. So his ownership mentality was around we own the relationships that we have, and that's how we achieve results. Justin Douglas came on very recently also, and he is the Dauphin County Commissioner. So what a treat to have somebody in such a position come on and talk about ownership through the political lens. He talked about it through the faith lens as a former pastor. And, politics being such a polarizing topic, I wasn't quite sure where that episode was going to go, honestly. But it was really, really profound in thinking about some of his answers. And his ownership answer was like, it's not my job to turn the lights on or to turn them off, but I want to make the room 10% brighter, right? So in taking the long game look at something, which leaders, this is what we have to do, right? We can't be in it for the short-term gains. Rather than promising dramatic transformation, he took the ownership of incremental progress. I want to make the room 10% brighter. So cool. Such a great episode. Totally check that one out. So many takeaways. What else? It's been such an amazing year. There were some really cool themes that came through. So, besides the values weaving in and out of these stories, there are really some lasting lessons that came out of the stories and the answers that people had to the questions I was able to ask them. Certainly, the incremental progress was one that came out from Mr. Douglas, but fundamental, focusing on fundamentals, that spoke pretty loudly from Nick Aday's talk around the ballet, mastering the the core concepts, right, through repetition. There's no shortcuts, Nick said, right? Stepping back, um, going back to Kurt's talk, you know, someone that has the experience of starting their own business, and we had several of those folks come on and talk. They know what it's like to start from the ground up. You had to do every single job, you had to wear every single hat. And at some point, the leaders have to start stepping back. That becomes super hard. We talked about that with Jesse a little bit. At one point, he had to do it to reconnect with his family, right? And he found that when he disconnected, his business did better. Kurt, he and I talked about that, right? So to become a strategic leader, we got to get out of those weeds and knowing when to learn and knowing when to step back. And many of us are still probably learning that lesson on a daily basis. Communication was certainly a theme, came through so many different conversations. Matt's conversation with strategic storytelling. Mary Oliveira had a great uh she had a great way to talk about, her emotional elevator. She talked about so how to know where you are on the ground floor every morning. So starting on the same place with your employees, right? Your direct reports want a predictable leader. They don't want somebody that's coming in hot or coming in cold, right? They want you coming in on the ground floor every morning. And so she talked about this and having this in her mind, thinking about having an emotional elevator and like, what floor am I on? And how do I get back to ground floor before I interact with my folks? Really super good. You can check her out, episode 9 with Javen. Oh my gosh, so many gems in Javen's conversation. That one you can check out, episode 13. So good. Really talked a lot about hiring for attitude um, over traditional qualifications, cultural fit, looking for growth potential. My favorite quote from him was the shop floor is a reflection of management's thinking. Such a great concept when you think about the reflection of leadership is always going to be evident when you look around, whether you're running a clinic, you're running an office, right? You're running a manufacturing site. What does that environment look like? How are the people interacting? What does the physical site look like? How are problems solved? What does communication look like? All of that is a reflection on leadership, right? So if you want to have a mirror to your leadership, go out and observe because that's going to be a reflection of what you've put in place, whether intentionally or accidentally. Such good stuff. One of our really big things that came out in many conversations was integration over balance. So there's often been this conversation out there about balance. You have to be in balance. And I kind of fight against that because when something's in balance, it's motionless, it's still, right? If you think about a balance beam, right, there's equal weight on either side, it means nothing's moving. And leadership's about movement, right? We're moving forward, we're getting better. And so many of our guests really talked about integration. They talked about, you know, the family as a leadership laboratory. So Justin Leader talked a little bit about that. How he first became a father. He said, having a kid is like missing someone your whole life and not realizing it until the day they were born. So beautiful, right? Our family is the first place that we are a leader. What does that look like? How does that translate to us leading teams? And how are we leading those teams? Are we leading them in ways that we want to show up as a family person? So, Nick Bryan, episode 3, he really talked about his commitment to his direct reports and their ability to get to the things that are important to them for their kids. And that's not a perk, right? That's not just for leadership, that's for everybody in the company. And that's a strategic advantage that helps attract and retain top talent. So that's pretty cool for them. Setting boundaries. Jesse talked a lot about boundaries once he kind of got out of that disconnect with his family and he set boundaries. There's a hard stop for him on when the office is over and when family starts. And one of the things we really dove into there was a transition activity. So the takeaway there was what is that thing that I do so that I can turn my brain off and I can, you know, re-engage at home, what we call act two, right? And if you've ever been to a play or some type of show, when you have an intermission and you come back, it's called the intermission problem, right? Act two, we need something big and exciting to happen to get you re-engaged with act two. And that's his transition activity, whether it's going outside and playing with his kids, it's starting dinner and cooking with the family, but something to get re-engaged and really make it salient that you're switching from work to home. And I thought that was a really key takeaway to really draw that big fat black line between work and home. So very cool there. Many of our folks talked about the physical foundation for mental performance. So we've got a lot of people that do a lot of great physical stuff, whether it's the ballet, whether it's marathon running with Drew, whether it's talking about sleep with Dr. Tierney, whether it's physical, lifting and those kinds of things with a couple other folks. There's a lot of connection between the mental performance of our leaders and the physical foundation for that. So those were some key things that we're weaving in and out of many conversations. And certainly listening and communication were big in many conversations. We talked about that certainly with Matt Zahn's strategic conversations. This is something you can't delegate. Leaders have to be having these conversations and knowing these stories to be sharing within their teams. Nick Bryan talked a lot about communication itself and how to communicate with different people and walked us through a culture exercise that he did that was very helpful. That's episode 3. So a lot of great stuff with listening and communication. And I think that builds those strong connections within your team, something that leaders have to rely on when, circumstances get difficult. So what's next, right? This was a fabulous year, wonderful guests. We started to dive into some of the leadership competencies, right? So we have some bonus episodes, some single episodes with leading yourself. We're going to talk about leading your team and leading systems coming in the next year as the top 3 competencies for leaders. But as we look forward, I really want to celebrate this first year. And I'm also reminded that the executive hustle is not about working harder, right? The hustle part is not necessarily like, okay, go faster, carry more. It's about getting better. It's about being more, not doing more. My son has a poster in his room, and of course it's baseball themed, but it says the game doesn't get easier. You just get better. And I think that fits here with our conversations and our themes. We're trying to lead well. We're trying to create environments where people can do their best while being themselves. The best leader is the one who is truest to themselves. This means we're building psychologically safe environments. We're setting forth clear communication systems and creating cultures that reward growth over perfection. We're not just leading well, we're living well. We're understanding that success without fulfillment isn't success at all. Our guests showed us that integration, not balance, is the goal. That when we bring our whole selves to leadership, we give other people permission to do the same. We're not just leading well and living well, but we're also learning well. We can't stay stagnant. We have to stay curious. We have to be vulnerable. We have to take ownership for our growth. And that means we're seeking feedback, even when it's painful. We're studying excellent examples when we find them. And we're seeking every learning opportunity that we can, and that every interaction is a learning opportunity, and that they're not always going to go well, but there always is going to be another one. So we're leading well, we're living well, and we're learning well in community with each other. So thank you so much. Thank you to every guest who shared their story, their struggles, and their wisdom. Thank you. Thank you to our listeners who've been on this journey with us, for your curiosity, for pushing to ask better questions, and for taking the insights that you heard into your own leadership and life contexts. As the Executive Hustle continues, the question isn't whether you will face challenges, but it is how you will choose to grow through them. Here is to another year of leading well, living well, and learning well together. Bye for now. Thank you for joining me today for another great hustle conversation with the Central PA Executive. You can find out more about my guest in the show notes. And if you liked the episode or have something to add to our conversation, please find me on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Subscribe, rate, and review. Remember, leadership is best practiced in community. You know a leader who needs to hear something from this episode, so pay it forward and send it to them today. Don't wait. Until next time, the best leaders not only lead well, they live well and learn well. Bye now.